So as we begin our last part of our evolution unit, we need to determine how do scientists know that a change in species happens, or what is the evidence of evolution? And one of the key terms that we'll be using is an ancestor. So we need to know that an ancestor is an early form of an organism from which later forms descend, that an ancestor is talking about what organisms look like within one species. Another term we'll use is a common ancestor. So a common ancestor is an ancestor that is shared between two or more species. So we're looking at how three or more species may be linked at some point in history. Some of the things that help us determine that is looking at fossils. Fossils are preserved remains of once living organisms from the past that are no longer living. And a lot of these organisms are extinct. We look at these organisms, and all of the organisms from around the world creates a record of all the things that have once lived on Earth. And we call this the fossil record. Although a lot of these organisms are extinct today, they have a lot of similarities to organisms or species that are still living on Earth today. Some of how we determine the age of a fossil is looking at two different things. So we can determine how old a fossil is based on where it's found on Earth. The older fossils are deeper, and the newer, younger fossils are closer to the surface. And this can help us determine the relative age of a fossil. How old is it in comparison to another fossil that has been found? Scientists are also able to discover approximately how old a fossil is by looking at the molecules that it's made up of, or the chemicals found within it. Molecules change over time, and so by looking at how the molecule is now, they're able to estimate how old the fossil is as well. Fossils are extremely important in determining common ancestors. It's thought that species with similar fossils once had common ancestors that also had similar fossils. So here's one example of an organism of how we use those common similarities or things that we look at. We call them homologous structures. So a homologous structure, homo meaning same, is same structure, is a part of an organism that has similar in structure and position on an organism, but it's different in how it is used or its function compared to other organisms. So if we look at a cat, a human, a whale, and a bat, all of these different colors are showing similar structures that are in a similar location. However, how they're used is different depending on the organism. So as we look at this, it's thought that species that share these homologous structures once had a common ancestor, although the more closely those structures are, the more closely related they are to one another. So looking at the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, they all have very similar similar structures. However, some are a little different than others, more different than others. And as we look at these, they have very different functions. Humans use their arms for picking things up and moving around. Cats are going to use their arms or legs for walking on. A whale uses these same similar structures as to help them swim, and a bat then uses them to help fly. Another thing that scientists can look at is called an analogous structure. So this is the part of an organism that performs a similar function, but differs in structure compared to other organisms. So these do not provide evidence of common ancestry or close relationships. They actually show how organisms may not be related. So looking at these structures here, we have two wings. One is from a bird and one is from an insect. The bird's is made of feathers and bone, whereas the wing of the insect is made out of keratin, which is a very different tissue. Another way that we are able to help determine common ancestry is looking at something called vestigial organs. Vestigial organ is a part of an organism that has lost its original function, but the structure or part of the structure still develops within ancestors of the original organism. So as we look at these vestigial organs, it is thought that species that share vestigial organs once had a common ancestor that used this organ and are more closely related to one another. So as we look at a whale, it also has a femur and a kneecap. However, a whale doesn't actually use a femur or a kneecap to walk, similar to humans have, whereas humans use them to walk. Another thing that a human has that other organisms have would be a coccyx, which is the tailbone. Humans don't have tails. However, they still have a bone that would be in that same place and location as organisms that do have tails. Another thing that scientists use as our technology has gotten more advanced is embryology, which is the study of development. It's thought that species that look similar in the early stages of development, so prior to birth, have a common ancestor that also share these early characteristics and are more closely related to one another. So the more similar they look early on in their development, the more closely related they are. If you look at each of these images, the organisms that are here look fairly similar and they have several similarities. However, each of them is a different organism. And lastly, scientists are looking at genetic evidence now that our technology has become more advanced. The more similar DNA is between two species, the more closely related they are. And in other words, organisms are more closely related to organisms with the least number of differences in DNA. So now, as we conclude this unit, we're going to be doing some activities that help us further understand each of these different pieces of evidence for how species have changed over time.